In this video, you're going to learn the solutions to the most common data issues I have seen with Mixpanel over the last 10 years. Now, I have about 15 problems and the solutions I will recommend. So I recommend you actually use the chapter links in the description that will take you to specific situations or challenges, as not all 15 might be relevant to you. Nonetheless, this is a deep dive into Mixpanel data issues. Let's jump right in. As always, I'm going to share my screen. Let's start with number 1. Event names don't make any sense. Now, the most common issue here is that when Mixpanel was implemented, there was no real thought given to the naming convention and the structure. I have talked about this endlessly in this channel in multiple videos. The key solution, the preventive solution here, if you're about to implement Mixpanel, or if you're willing to completely re-implement all the data, is to use a tracking plan. You can see a tracking plan here. This is a Google Sheets tracking plan. You can do in Excel, you can do in Google Docs, you can do in a whiteboard, you can do on paper. It doesn't really matter. The whole point is to spend some time outside of the code, figuring out the event names, the event properties, and in the case of Mixpanel, the profile properties. So you should have some logical naming convention. If you have an event like sign up, it should be called sign up or sign up completed. If you have a purchase event, it should probably be called that, and so on. Doing it on paper, on Google Sheets, and so on, it's easier because you can rename things. You can delete rows, you can add rows, you can see if something makes sense, you can share with other people, get their opinions, all before you write code. This is the preventive solution to the problem of event names don't make any sense. Now, let's say you tell me, hey, Ruben, we already have data. We have 12 months of historical data. We're not going to go re-implement. It's going to cause a bunch of issues. I hear you. Solution number 2 is to simply rename them inside Mixpanel. So if you go inside Mixpanel, you're going to have what's called the lexicon. It's available here in this data management icon, lexicon, and you end up here. So here we have all the events in this demo project. You can see that this project, of course, followed my advice and named the events logically. Document created, document opened, document downloaded. This is actually a demo app similar to DocuSign. So right away, we can kind of get a sense of what each event does. However, you can actually go into any event in your project. And if you have admin permissions, you can actually rename it to give it a display name. So the tracking the name stays the same, whatever that is, but it can be displayed differently within a Mixpanel interface. So this is your second solution. If you're not willing to re-implement all your data, fair enough. You can simply give them completely different display names. And sometimes I do this when I face something similar, or I just simply don't want to re-implement a bunch of data. So give it your own display name. You can actually do the same for event properties and profile properties. You can just give them custom display names inside Mixpanel. So for the perspective of a user who's interacting with this data, it doesn't really matter what the original code name is. They're just going to be looking at the display name. Number 2, I can't slice data or break it apart. So if we have a chart here in Mixpanel, which is the basic chart, the insights report, we're going to pop in an event here called document created. And if you implement the data properly, again, we go back to the tracking plan where you outline the events, event properties, and so on, then you're going to have the ability to break down this event by a host of different properties. So if you go to just the event level properties, we'll have things like the UTM source, collaboration, template use. If we use document type, for example, we pop that in. And now we have a bunch of breakdowns, in this case of document type down here. And the whole chart is broken down. And of course, we can do a bunch of other things we might expect here, change the chart type, different date ranges, and so forth. If you have the right event properties, the breakdowns, the slicing of the data is really easy. That's kind of what Mixpanel is built for. But if you open this on your own Mixpanel account and you don't have the properties you see here, or you don't have the ones you're looking for example, you may have some event like document created, but you don't have document type, then you're simply missing it. And it needs to be added by one of your developers. This is the events report. It's just helpful to see data come in real time. We have the same event here, document created. And if we open the properties, we can actually see 2 categories of properties. First, we have Mixpanel properties. These are actually captured automatically by the Mixpanel SDKs, typically the JavaScript or client-side SDKs, iOS, Android, and so forth. So we'll have things like browser, city, country, there's device information, screen width, and so forth. You don't have to worry about this unless you're doing backend tracking, which we'll cover in a different situation. And your properties are the ones that you're passing on yourself. So once again, if you go to the events report, which is right here, you open this, you find the events you're looking for, whatever you care about, and you don't see any properties here, or you don't see the ones you're looking for, they are simply missing. They need to be added. And once they're added, then you're going to be able to slice and dice the data as you see fit. Number 3, I cannot see region, country, device information in Mixpanel. So for this, it's helpful to actually dive a little bit deeper into how the Mixpanel SDKs actually work. So there is a very clear distinction between the client-side SDKs, JavaScript, iOS, Android, and so forth, and backend SDKs, Ruby, Python, PHP, and so forth. For the client-side SDKs, they typically collect a bunch of properties for you. You don't have to do anything. It just happens automatically. Now, this document here called default properties, automatic collected properties, you can Google this, you can find the same document. Here, you're going to see exactly what's being collected automatically. For example, so here we have city, region, and country. And what Mixpanel is actually doing here is actually collecting the IP address of the user and then parses that into these 3 different distinct properties. Again, happens behind the scenes. You don't do anything. You can tweak it, actually. You can stop it from happening, but you don't have to enable it by default. Now, there's other things that are also being collected. If you actually go down here to the client SDKs, we have, for example, browser version, OS version, there's app device version, the screen width, screen height we saw earlier before, refer domain, there's UTM tags, and so forth. It's a bunch of the stuff that, as you can see, is kind of collected automatically depending on what SDK you're using. So you have 2 options. You can either use the client SDKs if you're not using them. This might be the issue where you're not seeing this data come in. So you might then leverage the JavaScript SDK or some iOS, Android SDK. Or if you prefer to do only backend tracking, which is a very good choice, it helps in a lot of different ways, then you have to manually pass a lot of these properties into the backend SDK. Let me show you an example. So this is the PHP SDK. Once again, it will not collect things like city, country, and region because it doesn't have it, but you're able to give it to it. So if you're to pass something called IP, $IP, then Mixpanel will then do the parsing for you. So you can pass $IP in your event properties or your user profile properties, and then Mixpanel will do the parsing for you and then give you city, region, and country out of that. Not every single property can be done this way. Some of the device information doesn't actually get parsed in the same way, but you're able to collect it on your own and pass it. So for example, you could collect the width and the height of the device and then actually pass it in your backend calls. One of the most common things I tend to do with clients is we do a lot of backend tracking because it's just overall better for the quality of tracking, ad blockers, that kind of stuff. But we collect several things on the client, and then we send it to the backend, and the backend sends it. So for example, we might collect the screen width, the screen height, of course, the IP. We might collect other device information like the OS, the app number, the app build number, a lot of stuff you saw. We sort of collect on the client. We then send that through the backend. This just happens behind the scenes. Actually, Mixpanel is not involved in this handoff. And then Mixpanel gets involved in the backend just to send the backend data. So you can also think about doing that. And just another way to bring in this missing event properties that you might be expecting from the client-side tracking. Number 4, the data is wrong, or I do not trust the data. Now, this is one of the most common issues I see. People go through the effort of implementing Mixpanel or similar tools, and then they don't trust the data. They say, hey, this number doesn't make sense. This is kind of weird. This is kind of funky. So let's dive a little bit into how I would debug this issue to kind of get to the root of it, because at the end of it, we should be able to have trustworthy data inside Mixpanel. So let's say we have a sign-up event. This is actually a good example of a number that people might look at and say, you know what? It says here we had 10,000 signups last month. I don't think that's right. I think we had 12, 15, 20,000, whatever. So I would first want to look for some technical tracking issues. So, we might be able to see some data in Mixpanel, but is it accurate? So I might, for example, look at, let's say, the average per user. Oh, no, I want this one, frequency per user, average. Now, some events are clearly only meant to be fired once. Typically, the events that people look at for accuracy of data tend to be sort of critical events. For example, signups, purchases, subscription started, those kind of things. So a sign up here, if there was any kind of technical tracking issue, we might see more signups per user than usual. Now, in this case, the average number of signups per user is 1. That's kind of what we expect, right? Users will only sign up once, typically. If this number was, for example, 1.20, 1.4, it means that about 40% of users are double firing this event. So that's clearly an issue that could be affecting it. Now, the second thing we need to do, and typically to be able to debug data, is not just necessarily in Mixpanel. We may see issues in Mixpanel, like, for example, the double firing of events. maybe missing event properties as we have seen in just previous situations. Those we can kind of consider technical tracking issues. But to understand if Mixpanel is the issue or not, we have to actually compare it to a second source. So if you have signups, we could compare it to our product backend and say, in the last month, how many signups, how many new users do we have in the product backend? How many is Mixpanel showing? And then from there, we can then make a consideration to say, is this really an issue or not? Another thing you want to consider when you're trying to debug data is time zones. Typically, product backends are in UTC, Universal Time Zone. But your Mixpanel data may be in something else. It may be, for example, Eastern, Pacific time, European time. If you're comparing it to another source like a Stripe, you want to double check that's the same time zone. And again, a few hours of difference between time zones can actually be enough to cause discrepancies, especially if you have large numbers. In a few hours, you could have thousands of conversions that could be missing just because of that. So double check time zones as that. And number 4 here is you want to remanage expectations. I have seen situations where the company or team had an expectation of what they were doing in terms of signups, purchases, conversion rates, a trial to paid conversion rate, for example. But that expectation was actually not set in reality. They had done some rough calculations, some napkin math, and it's actually not correct. And the Mixpanel data is actually correct, even though it's different from what they expected. So just figure out those elements, right? It could be technical, it could be time zones, it could be something legitimate with the secondary source once you compare it, or it could be sort of what we may call psychological. There has to be a resetting of expectations of what the numbers are actually. Number 5, funnels are broken. Now, another common situation, let's say if we open a funnel here in Mixpanel, you might see something like this. You might see lots of data in step 1, but then somehow a complete breakdown of the data to step 2, step 3, and 4. This is clearly a broken funnel. Now, in this case, I'm using demo data. I'm kind of breaking the funnel on purpose, right? This document created sign up event. This is not the order they would go in. But just to show you, this is what broken funnels look like. You may either be a complete 0%, or in some cases, you have very low conversion numbers, 1%, 2%, when the answer should clearly be 20, 40, 50, 60%. So to understand a broken funnel, we have to then understand user profiles and how actual data gets tied together. If you open a regular profile, and all of this is demo data, so there's no privacy information being shared here. Your goal when you implement Mixpanel is to have a single profile for every user where all their data appears. This might mean all the data from different devices. If they are using the app on, let's say, web, iOS, and Android, if they have 3 devices, there should be 3 devices worth of data in a single profile. You should be able to tie anonymous activity and known activity. So when a user comes to your website the first time, they might look at several pages, look at the pricing, and then create an account. All the activity they did before they create the account should be tied, and this is done through the Mixpanel.identify. I'll have a couple caveats on this, but generally, you have this anonymous activity. At some point, the user becomes known to you. They give you their email address. They create an account. Then you identify them with Mixpanel by providing the email address to Mixpanel, providing a user ID to Mixpanel, and then Mixpanel kind of joins it together. So if you cannot see all the data in one single profile, then something's broken. You have to double check your identify procedures if you have them. You may need to look at alias, which is another way to combine data depending on your identification settings. But that's really the goal. So be able to see a user profile, and you can actually test this on your own, right? You can open an incognito window. You should go through the different marketing pages, the pricing pages, create an account, onboard, become a subscriber, whatever. And then you should be able to find your profile on Mixpanel using the email address you provided during sign up. And then you should be able to see all the activity. You should be able to say, hey, I saw 4 pages in the marketing site before I create the account. There should be 4 page view events. And then I create the account, and then I onboard it, blah. You should be able to, it should be very one-to-one. So if you don't see that, that's typically what leads to broken funnels. There's a disconnect somewhere between where users started and where users should be in relation to the funnel. If you actually go back to the funnel itself, once the funnel is fixed, it should really look something like this. So now a regular rough funnel looks like this, right? You have lots of data in step 1, then some kind of conversion rate to step 2, and the conversion rate is within expectations of this specific funnel. One more thing is actually on the identification setting. So historically, Mixpanel has had a little bit of a complex way to identify users. They actually have 3 ID management systems, just to show you how complex it was. Now, before March 2020, they have a system that they now call legacy ID management. This is probably the most complex. This system used to use mixpanel.alias and identify at the same time, and there were a bunch of issues with it. You had race conditions. Anyway, so if your project was created before this, you're likely using this ID management system. In 2020, they released the original ID merge, and this was sunset in 2023 when they released Simplify ID merge. So if you create your project after March 2023, you're on Simplify. This is the easiest, so you're less likely to have issues. If you're in between, you're going to be in the original ID merge, and you may have some issues here. And of course, if you're before 2020, you're on the legacy. Generally, though, what you want here is actually be able to experiment. So be able to say, if you just fire the identify call, is that enough to tie user activity? If not, maybe you need the alias to do it as well. Maybe the alias functions differently. One thing to note is that if you have a production project and a development project, you want to make sure they both have the same ID system. I know it's kind of funky. I just had an issue where the production and development had different ID management systems, and one thing worked in one, but it didn't work in the other. It was actually quite frustrating. So double check that. You can actually go into your project settings, and you'll be able to find which ID management system your project is using. And based on that, you can then tweak and play around with the identify process to find the way to connect this user. Number 6, experiment A/B testing data is not showing. Now, if you're on a higher plan of Mixpanel, you may have access to the experiment function here in Mixpanel. It's actually available here in this little icon, applications, experiments. And you have here, and then you can select an experiment, select the dashboard where the data is, break it down by property, and it shows you the performance of an A/B test experiment. So it'll show you the control versus variant A, variant B, and so forth. It's quite handy. A lot of times these days, I work with teams who they can actually do the A/B testing logic on their backend. That is, they can decide which experiment to show a user. It's sort of straightforward from a technical perspective. But displaying the data that compares the control versus the variant is maybe a little trickier, and Mixpanel can help you do that. So if you already have Mixpanel, great. You don't need to go to perhaps a standalone A/B testing tool like WVO, Google Optimize, which I believe doesn't exist anymore, and so forth. But if you don't see any data here and you have access to this, you have to double check your tracking to ensure that you're passing experiment data. Let me show you. So Mixpanel actually looks for a very specific tracking code to figure out these experiments. They're actually looking for an event name called $experiment started. Side note, anything that has a $sign before it is actually a special Mixpanel property or event. So it's something system related that Mixpanel expects and looks for. So the event name will be called $experiment _ started. It has to be exactly this. It's case sensitive. And then it'll look for 2 event properties, experiment name and then variant name. And if you actually see the code here, we see the same thing, right? $experiment _ started. Then we have experiment name. Just know that this is not underscore and it doesn't have the $sign. I know it's a little funky, but that's just how it is. And then the variant name, same thing, no underscore, no $sign. It's actually title case for both of those. So you fire this event whenever a user enters an experiment. So they view either the control or a variant. And then you pass on the name of the experiment, which can be anything you want, of course. And you pass on the variant name, which of course can also be anything you want. So as soon as you start passing it into Mixpanel and you start passing these events, then you'll be able to actually use this special experiment functionality inside Mixpanel to do the comparisons and show the statistical significance and so forth. Number 7, Mixpanel is not tracking across domains. Now, we first want to make a distinction here. Typically, if you load Mixpanel on your domain, it will also work on any kind of subdomain. So if your domain is google.com, any subdomains such as gmail.google.com, calendar.google.com, those will be completely fine. So this is not in reference to that. If you're not seeing that subdomain tracking well, you actually want to double check just your SDK settings because that typically is not an issue. The issue is if you have multiple domains. So for example, you want to go from google.com to google.ca. These are completely different domains. The cookies are set under the domain itself. And if a user goes from that domain to the second domain, then typically the tracking breaks completely. You're not going to have a single profile view of that user because they moved across domains and that tracking is not working well. If you're tracking across the backend, this is probably not an issue because you can fix it on your own. But this is typically something that some products will see, especially like e-commerce sites where they may have their e-commerce site domain, but then the checkout actually happens on a different domain altogether. It's not even a subdomain. So if you want to track across domains, there's a few things we want to do. First, we actually want to find the distinct ID of the user. This is actually what Mixpanel assigns to a user. If we actually go into the code itself, you can see me here in the console, and you fire this code here in the JavaScript SDK, mixpanel.get distinct ID, then you get an ID. So this is actually the ID of my user here, 23667. And what we then want to do is we want to pass this as a URL parameter into the second domain. So let me show you. So if you open here, let's imagine that we're going to go from, let me actually copy this. We're going to go from mixpanel.com and we're actually going to go to some, I don't know, mixpaneldata.com. Again, a completely different domain. So we actually want to pass the distinct ID from the first domain into the second domain. So we might pass it like this, for example, something like this. So every link that goes from the first domain to the second domain, and of course you can imagine basically from the second domain to the first domain, any link that goes between domains will then be appended a URL parameter with the distinct ID of the user. In this case, that is the 2336271. So we append it. The user goes to the second domain, mixpanel-data.com. In the second domain, then we need some logic to capture that ID and then fire the mixpanel.identify that we have seen earlier. As soon as you fire it, then in the second domain, Mixpanel will set this ID as the distinct ID, and it will connect the activity in a single profile, right? So the work here is you have to get the distinct ID of the user. You have to append any links that go to a second domain with the ID. When the user lands in the second domain, then you have to capture the ID and then fire Mixpanel identify, and the process sort of repeats when they go from one domain to the other. That's effectively cross-domain tracking at its bare bones. You might need to do some testing and tweaks to get this working. You can actually use any URL parameter. It doesn't have to be distinct_ID. You can call it whatever you want. You just have to make sure that this process is consistent and reliable, and it tends to fire pretty early on for a user when they land in the second domain. Number 8, UTM tags are not being captured. Now, UTM tags are very helpful for marketing attribution. You may have seen them. This is like UTM source, UTM medium, UTM campaign, and so forth. Now, Mixpanel with the JavaScript SDK will automatically collect this for you. If we actually open the documentation here, we can see that actually Mixpanel is tracking a lot of UTM tags. So it tackles the 5 UTM tags: source, campaign, medium, term, and content, and actually tracks ID as well, platform, campaign ID, and so actually it tracks a few other ones. But the 5 core ones is actually source, campaign, medium, term, and content. The other ones are just special. So it'll be tracking this ones, and it actually tracks them in 2 ways. It'll track what's effectively last touch, so the last UTM tags the user had, and it also tracks first touch, the very first tags the user has, and you can see that it actually labels them as slightly differently. There's initial UTM source, and then you have just UTM source, or initial UTM campaign, and of course use UTM campaign. So again, out of the box, without you doing anything, UTM tags should be tracked. So if you're not seeing it, there's a couple things that could be happening. 1, you may need to update your SDK. Perhaps you're using an outdated SDK for the JavaScript, so double check that. 2, you may not be using the SDK. We have talked a lot about backend tracking, which again is generally better, but one of the downsides is some things may not be available. So if you have that, if you have backend tracking and you're not using the JavaScript SDK, you have 2 options. You can use the JavaScript SDK and then combine the client-side activity with the backend activity. It's possible, a little trickier. Or you can somehow capture the UTM tags on the client, hand them off to the backend, and the backend will send them to Mixpanel. Something else that we have done. So a couple different ways of handling, but generally the easiest is of course just to use the JavaScript SDK. It'll do it for you. It'll do the logic for you, the initial versus the last touch. If you don't want to do that, you want to do it on your own, then you have to capture them, send them to the backend, and you may actually need to do the same logic yourself to do some kind of like initial tags versus last touch. One thing that may help you here to do that logic of the first versus last touch is that Mixpanel actually has something called set versus set once. So if you see here this mixpanel.set, you're going to set this profile properties, plan and company, and every time you fire set, the values get updated basically. So you're setting them over and over again as long as you fire them. But you do actually have a set once option, which means that you fire set once and it will only be set one time. So you could fire, for example, UTM tags with a set once, and those will only get fired once. And then the set actually are the last touch, if that kind of makes sense. So set once can be the initial UTM tags, and then set becomes the last touch, which are always sort of renewed and updated depending on what the user has. So that can maybe help you do some of the logic itself if you want to do that on the backend. Number 9, profile properties are not being saved. So profile properties can be really helpful. You may have some default out of the box like city, region, country, and so forth. But sometimes helpful to pass other things. For example, you may pass first name and last name, email address, subscription status, when they started a subscription, when they started a trial, those kind of things. However, if you're passing them and you're not seeing them in your profile, you may want to double check the logic that you're doing that. So if we go here to the JavaScript SDK, but this is similar across all SDKs, before we can set properties here, so here we're going to set 2 profile properties called plan and company respectively. Before we do that, we actually need to fire identify at least once per page load. So we fire the identify call, we fire a user ID that we're using to identify user with Mixpanel, and then we can set properties. So if you're having issues, you may not be firing the Mixpanel identify. You may need to double check your logic. For example, single page apps may have some funky behavior here that may need to be tweaked. Typically, firing identify over and over again is not a big issue. So if you're not seeing it work, you don't have to worry too much about firing identify more than once. It's something that just you fire it, Mixpanel recognizes it, and it's completely fine. So just double check your logic for when you're setting profile properties and if you have identified the user appropriately. Something else that you might want to double check here is race conditions. Again, I don't expect race conditions to be common in this scenario, but just double check that as well. You may fire the identify. Maybe there's some delay that means it arrives after the Mixpanel people set, and that may be causing some issues. Again, some debugging and testing will be needed on your end to ensure that this works as expected. Number 10. Opt-out tracking is not working. Now, a lot of stuff we talk about is, of course, how to track users, but it is possible to also opt out users, and users may opt out themselves, and we have to be able to respect that. This is much more common in the European Union, where, of course, GDPR is much more prevalent. Some US states now have equivalent legislation to GDPR, California, for example. So the opt-out is becoming more common. Now, Mixpanel does have specific SDK settings for opting out users. Let me show you those. So for example, we have Mixpanel track, right? We're firing some event, and then we can actually fire Mixpanel.optout tracking, which then prevents the SDK from sending any more data to the user. So if you're to fire any event, then it will no longer work. This can be handy. You may have users, for example, who choose to opt out themselves, maybe by rejecting a cookie banner or some other setting. And at that point, we can actually fire this opt-out tracking, and we don't really have to do anything else for the other users. The data can still be sent normally, but the SDK itself will prevent any data from being sent to this specific user. You can, of course, have some specific settings for the project itself, right? Maybe you opt out by default, and you're actually going to change this only when the user accepts cookies. This can be one option. You may then, there's an opt-in tracking equivalent to enable the tracking for the user. There's, of course, some settings if you have some European requirements. For example, you can change where the data gets sent. Mixpanel has a European server here. They have also one for India. You can disable specific properties. So you could disable IP, which means you'll no longer have the city, region, and country being parsed from it. You can disable device information. You can actually disable any kind of properties nonetheless. You can blacklist them down here. So just several ways they can do to prevent data from being sent to Mixpanel. I have worked on some projects that say in healthcare where any kind of PII is not acceptable. So we're not, of course, sending names and emails, but we also want to remove all the potential PII like IPs, like device, even the user IDs or hash. So there's lots of different ways you can make Mixpanel more privacy friendly, depending on what you're looking for. I also want to note cookie consent tools, which might be helpful here, that can help you do a lot of this logic. So cookie consent tools are typically tools like Osano, OneTrust. I think there's one called CookieBot, Quantcast. I think Google Tag Manager can help you actually deal with consent as well. Effectively, this is the cookie banners that you see it, and it says, do you want to accept cookies? Yes or no. Every company handles them a little bit differently depending on where they are. Some companies are opt-in by default. Some companies are opt-out by default, like in the European Union. But generally, a lot of this cookie consent tools can actually integrate with tools like Mixpanel. So actually, they do the opt-out, opt-in for you. So they know that if a user opts out, then they'll trigger the opt-out tracking code we saw before. If they do the opt-in, then they trigger the opt-in tracking and so forth. So just different ways that you can manage this if you're looking for something a little bit more extensive. Number 11, ad blockers are limiting our data. Now, this is very common, especially over the last few years. Now, with more ad blockers, We have cookie privacy issues. So client-side data generally is becoming less reliable as time goes on. Now you have several options to deal with this. Number one, which I have alluded throughout this entire video, is actually moving more towards backend tracking. It can be highly reliable from a data perspective. There are some things that need to be done to bring in the same quality of data, that is, those event properties, the IP address, the device information. But generally, if you can do that, and it's straightforward to do, then the backend tracking can be a fantastic way to slowly move away from client-side tracking. And in a lot of the setups I see today, we maybe have 80% backend tracking and 20% client-side tracking, with that 20% slowly become less and less as time goes on. Now, there are other things you can do to maintain the client-side tracking while still dealing with the ad blockers. Number one, if I go back to the documentation here, is to track via proxy. Effectively, what's going on here with ad blockers is they are looking at the Mixpanel SDK, the Mixpanel URL, and they're preventing the URL from loading on your page itself. However, if you track via proxy, you can actually make the Mixpanel SDK load via your own domain. So let's imagine that your domain is, again, google.com. You can make it so Mixpanel is actually loading from google.com/mixpanel.js. You're loading the JavaScript file. In that case, ad blockers may have a much harder time blocking that because it's your own domain. It could be your own file. It's hard to say if this is actually a Mixpanel or not. You don't even have to call it mixpanel.js. You could call it whatever you want. You could call it, bunnies.js. So tracking via proxy is an option. Mixpanel, of course, offer this. This is in the JavaScript SDK. They have an option to do a proxy, and then you can change the library URL to then be your proxy domain to this JS file, and then the API host, again, you kind of make this your own domain. So this is the option Mixpanel recommends or offers with the JavaScript SDK. You kind of create your own proxy domain, you load the JavaScript file from that domain, and then you just change the SDK itself to look for that. I never done this option myself. I typically have done this actually to Google Tag Manager. So Google Tag Manager can load on the client side, perhaps what most people are familiar with, but there's actually a server-side component that was released maybe a few years ago. And the server-side component can then be set up in a way that you're actually loading the client-side version of GTM, but you're loading it through your own domain. So the setup is actually quite straightforward. It's quite nice because then you can still maintain the usability of Google Tag Manager on the client side, and you can actually use the usability of Google Tag Manager on the server side, which allows you to do backend tracking across Facebook ads, Google ads, and a bunch of things. So this can be actually a solid option that allows you to, again, load scripts, whether Mixpanel, Google Analytics, Segment, whatever you want, through your own domain, through your own first-party cookies, and this helps you deal with ad blockers. So this is one option I have used myself. It worked quite well. I've, of course, also done the backend tracking as a secondary option. So we have at least two different ways of doing it. And there's, of course, a proxy server itself that Mixpanel offers, which is kind of similar to what GTM does. It's just a little bit more manual on your end. So whatever option you choose, this is typically the way you're dealing with ad blockers today. I do want to make a note that you still want to respect privacy, depending on where you are. So this is not a way to get around privacy, even though it technically lets you do that. You still want to find a way to allow users to opt out and remove themselves from tracking if need be. Number 12, we don't have historical data. Now, this is a very common issue. Typically, when you implement Mixpanel, you don't have anything that happened before the implementation took place. So you may have years of historical data that you would love to see in Mixpanel, but it's not quite there. Now, the first challenge you have to overcome here is ensuring that you actually have this data. Something that many product teams are surprised by is that when they implement Mixpanel, there are several events that get implemented in Mixpanel that are actually not tracked anywhere. For example, you may have signups, you may have purchases, but perhaps you actually do not store the onboarding progress that a user has done in between those things. So there may be 5 steps in your onboarding, and you don't actually save those steps. So a user either completes the onboarding or they have to restart that every single time. So in that case, you may have 5 events for your onboarding, but you have no historical basis to be able to replicate those events before that. That's okay. Typically, when we think about importing historical data, we want to bring in the key events. If you implement Mixpanel with 20 events, going forward, you're going to have those 20 events. But if you want to bring historical data, you might only bring in maybe 5 events, the most important events, especially because the historical process can be a bit tricky to do nonetheless. So the first challenge is to figure out what data you can import. The second challenge is just to figure out how to do it. The general process here is there has to be the data stored somewhere, some kind of database, maybe a data warehouse. The data may need to be clean. So it may need to be renamed on the event name level or the event property level to ensure it matches with your Mixpanel data. You may need to be able to append some kind of identifier like a user ID or an email, ensure your times are correct, they're in the right format, and so forth. So there's some cleanup data that has to happen. And then number 3, you figure out how to send it, which is just writing some kind of script that then fires the data into the Mixpanel API. The Mixpanel has an API endpoint called import events. You can see it here. Depending on your region, whether it's the European Union or the US region, and then /import. And down here, you just simply pass in the JSON data of your event, the properties, distinct ID, which is very helpful, and insert ID, and so forth. So there's a few things you want to double check here. I think this is actually a better one. So we have our event name. We want to make sure that matches to our existing data. We're passing the time itself in a Unix timestamp format. We have to pass some kind of distinct ID. This is the ID we're going to use to identify users. Most likely going to be a user ID for our user itself. Could be an email, though that's less reliable. Insert ID tends to be just a random ID for this specific event. IP and any other properties you want to pass on that you have and are available. So relatively straightforward. I've seen many different teams just write very simple scripts in lots of different languages to take that clean raw data and then send it to this import endpoint, and then just have a basic way of checking if things worked out properly. So not too bad. This is one way of doing it. You can also use the Python SDK, which actually Mixpanel recommends as well. So the Python SDK works like any other SDK, like PHP, Ruby, and so forth. But it also actually has a function here called import data, which is simply calling the import endpoint itself. But the benefit here might be that you may be more familiar with Python. Perhaps you can write the scripts in Python, you can check, you can run tests on Python, and then just simply send the data in the Python language into the import endpoint. But again, same thing, right? We're passing the distinct ID, the event name, the timestamp, the properties, the API secret, and so forth. So it's more or less the same process. So this is helpful. You can actually import years worth of data into Mixpanel. You want to check your pricing limits. Some pricing plans in Mixpanel don't let you see data more than 90 days, of course, so double check that. But generally, from an import perspective, you can do as much as you want, as long as you have the data in the right format and you have the necessary properties. So this can be a handy way to be able to provide historical context to data. Number 13, integrations don't work. Now, there's several ways you can integrate Mixpanel data. You can take data out of Mixpanel and you can bring data into Mixpanel. So let's look at a couple situations. First, we have data pipelines. This is just taking data out into some kind of data warehouse, Google BigQuery, Amazon Redshift, Amazon S3, and so forth. So generally, the first thing you want to know here is there is actually a special pricing plan for data pipelines packages. Let me see if I can show you that. So at some point in your pricing screen, you're going to see something like this. After choosing how many events you want, whether 5 million, 10 million events a month, or whatever it is, you have add-ons and you have the data pipelines add-on. This is on an annual basis. You can see on a monthly basis. And once you have this add-on, then you can send data into any of those data warehouse destinations we saw earlier before. So this is a prerequisite. Once you enable this, then there are specific settings for whatever data warehouse you choose. For example, this is BigQuery. And in BigQuery, the general steps, right? We need to create a data set, grant permissions to Mixpanel. Let's go see that. So you're doing this in Google Cloud. You grant permissions through the user interface to Mixpanel. And you provide the necessary details into Mixpanel itself, such as the Google Cloud project ID, the database name, the region, and then Mixpanel will start to export this data into BigQuery automatically on some kind of frequency. This is generally very reliable integration. If there's some kind of error, Mixpanel can actually deal with it properly. For example, there might be a billing error on Google Cloud, which prevents Mixpanel from sending data. Once you fix the billing issue, then Mixpanel will just redo any errors and so on. So very few issues, assuming you have the pricing plan and you have followed all the correct steps to be able to enable the data warehouse itself. Next, let's look at the other integrations. There's lots of different kinds, right? You can send data to Braze and MailChimp. There's webhooks, there's Google Ads, there's Facebook Ads. As you can imagine, the settings vary dependent on the integration itself. We're going to look at Braze as an example here, but generally, what we need to do here is there needs to be a way to connect data from Mixpanel to the source. So if we have Braze, which is a tool for sending emails, there needs to be a way to tell Braze, this users in Mixpanel need to be matched with these users inside Braze. The way you do this is typically by user ID. So whatever user ID you're using in Mixpanel, needs to be the same user ID that you're using in Braze. They might call it differently. Braze calls it an external ID. Mixpanel will call it perhaps a user ID or distinct ID, but they need to be the same. And that's how then the tools are able to match the data. So let's actually look at Braze itself. So same thing, we're going to set up the integration. Let's go down here. There's going to be some API keys you get from Braze to be able to send the data to. Then you can send cohorts into Braze. And again, as long as you have that unification of IDs, which is down here, which in this case is the user ID in Mixpanel and the external ID in Braze, as long as those are the same, then the tools are able to reconcile the data and combine it. And you can actually send Braze events into Mixpanel, which can be very handy because then Braze can send all these events into Mixpanel: email delivery, email bounce, email open. And same thing, for Braze to do that, Braze needs to have the same user ID as Mixpanel. And as long as that works, then the data will flow into Mixpanel. It will be tied to the right profile, and everything will work as expected. So you have to double check the settings with each integration to make sure this is combined. Some integrations don't use user IDs and will actually use emails. So you have to make sure you have emails in Mixpanel to start. And two, that those emails can then be matched across platforms. Some integrations don't actually use anything like this, like Facebook ads. Doesn't use necessarily that. And it's not a two-way data flow. But you're going to have to double check the specific settings for each destination to make sure that it works as expected. Also, one note is some may have like troubleshooting errors, like FYIs. You want to go through all those errors to make sure that nothing's breaking. So generally not complex, but every integration has specific settings that you have to go through to make sure that they work as expected. Number 14, user flows are useless. Now, the user flow report is actually quite handy. It's a companion to the funnels report, but sometimes people don't find them as helpful. This is actually a user flow here. We're using sign up as our starting event here at the far left. And then we have 3 steps before that. We can, of course, add more steps. We can add, 1 step, 4 steps, 5 steps. Instead of having a starting event, we can have an ending event. So, for example, we want to see how users flow through the app to become a purchase subscriber. So the key in flows is you really have to be able to filter down. So once you have this event here, you need to be able to hide in events that you don't really care. For example, this is future use event here. You know what? I don't really care about this event, so I'm just going to hide it. I think I want document created. Those are fine. Document edited. Then we have a bunch of events here. 70% of events are actually in other events here. So we have to be able to then kind of expand this out to add more rows to be able to see more events, and maybe keep going and doing this. Eventually, we might expand by a specific property, maybe by a UTM source, for example, that we want to see how this compares. But this is generally the issue with flows is that it's not as easy as other reports. We build funnels. Within seconds, we can kind of get some insights. It kind of makes sense logically. We can still dive deeper and break it down, but the data makes sense from the get-go. Flows, you really have to make those tweaks. You really have to explore the data to figure out what are the most common paths. Let me remove that event. Let me focus only on new users. Let me focus only on users who came from Facebook. And then once you have a hypothesis, then perhaps you do some tweaks in your app to reinforce the hypothesis. You can perhaps use funnels to see how the conversion rate is changing over time. Then you go back to flows and so forth. So this is a great tool for a product manager who sort of has the time to be able to dive deeper into the data, play around with it until they find the exact path that they care about, or at least someone who has time to experiment with different communication structures, different onboarding screens, and so forth. So not necessarily a useless report, but one that definitely requires much more handholding to get to a usable state. Number 15, Signal isn't providing any usable insights. So if you open the Signal report, which is down here in Applications, Signal, this report is actually built on what can now be considered sort of like tech lore. Many years ago, Facebook released an insight that they say, hey, we just realized that if a user adds like 8 friends within 7 days of them signing up to the platform, they are much more likely to be retained over the long term. So many tools like Mixpanel, Amplitude, they actually built reports to do this. Facebook most likely did this on their own, just using raw analysis and custom tools. But Mixpanel kind of built this into a natural report where you can actually build specific user cohorts. You can take some kind of frequency, some kind of goal. This is 2nd week retention, but we can make this wherever we want. And look at events, and then run this correlation report. And down here, you can then start to see which events tend to be correlated with the goal that you want, which is second week retention in this report. Now, the signal report has several prerequisites before you can even use it. First, you need to have enough data for it. I would say at least thousands of conversions in whatever time period you're looking at. So if it's a 90-day period and you're looking at purchases, you most likely need to have at least thousands of those purchases to make it useful. And really, the more data you have, the more useful it is. So this is one report that, one, is on a higher pricing plan. So unless you're even on those pricing plans, you're not going to see it. And two, it really benefits companies that have millions of data points and not just thousands, but hundreds of thousands of conversions. So at least a minimum of 1,000 conversions. Number two, I think it's really helpful to narrow it down to specific conversions itself. Second week retention may actually be too broad, but if you're to narrow it down to something like a purchase, maybe like a document created or something like that, then we may start to have much more usable data, right? So find something like a subscription start that can be a great event, and you want to see what actions users are taking that make sense to drive those subscriptions started. And number three, it probably also makes sense to narrow down the user itself. So all users may be nice, but perhaps we actually want to look at new users. This is a cohort of just users who are new to the product over the last 30 days. This one actually didn't work. So let's go back to all users. So some narrow down of user groups may make sense depending on, again, how many users you have in that cohort, what is the number of conversions those users made, and so forth. So a little bit of tweaking, some specificity, I think will make this report more helpful. But if you don't have the volume of data, it's not really going to be useful regardless of what you do. So just something to keep in mind here when you look at this report. And then even down here, you may start to say, okay, you know what, document edited kind of makes sense. It looks like the sort of the optimum amount is about once. So perhaps we're going to drive our onboarding to get users to edit the document once within that 7-day or 14-day free trial. Some of the insights may be kind of obvious, so you may not even find it kind of useful. It just, again, just depends on what you're looking at, what it looks for. I think at best, it can provide validation for how you're thinking about your onboarding and those first 2 weeks in the product and what the data can say about the best way to move forward. And that's all I have. Wow, this is a long video. So we looked at 15 situations, challenges that tend to affect Mixpanel data quality. Lots of things from tracking issues to reports to more nitty-gritty advanced tracking techniques that may be needed if you're using Mixpanel. I'm not sure if all of it was helpful to everybody, but I'm sure at least one or two challenges will be helpful to someone and just be able to dive a little bit deeper into the Mixpanel tool itself and talk a little bit more advanced, just beyond this is how you track events, this is how you track profile properties. We can look at more at the advanced elements of what it means to get the most out of your Mixpanel data. That's everything I have for today. As always, my name is Ruben Ugarte. There's a few links in the description box below that I think you'll find helpful. Number one, if you're looking for more in-depth help with your Mixpanel data, get in touch. The website is rubenugarte.com. There's a couple of ways that I help a handful of companies every year with their Mixpanel and, of course, other tools. So that might be a good fit for you, so check that out. Number two, there's a link to my newsletter, Averages Lie. There's a weekly email that goes out, typically 5 minutes or less, just diving on many of the ideas we talk about in this channel in a written format. I think it's another great way to stay in touch and keep diving more into how to get the most out of your data. Number three, there is a link to my book, The Data Mirage. This book covers the entire process from start to finish for why companies fail to actually use data and what they can do about it. The book is available everywhere books are sold. So there's a paperback, there's an audiobook, there's Kindle, there's even a hardbook cover. So look for those links in the description. And number four, of course, if you enjoy this, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. I'd love to hear your questions themselves. Put them in the comment box below. I do my best to answer them. With that being said, I'll see you next week.